Welcome to Romans chapter 1. This is the third section in 10. Paul says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith." Okay, so Paul refers to the gospel. Gospel means good news, and it's the good news about what Jesus has done to pay for our sin in full, rising from the dead, and offering to anybody who believes free forgiveness as a gift, salvation as a gift. That's the good news. So it's the power of God, because anybody who believes goes from death to life. Goes from being an enemy of God to being his friend, from being estranged from God to being his child. They get the Holy Spirit regenerating them, coming inside them, making them spiritually alive. They get reconciliation with God. They get an inheritance of being with Jesus forever in heaven in his new creation. It makes all the difference. That is some serious power. And then Paul says that the gospel is first to be offered to the Jews and then to the Greeks. God made sure to not forget his special people and offer to them the truths of the gospel first and then to the Greeks. It doesn't mean he thinks that they're better, but they are precious to him, and so he offers to them the gospel first. So Paul says that the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel. Well, how is that? Well, God is righteous. He cannot tolerate any sin in his presence. And he wants us to be saved because he loves us. He wants us to have forgiveness and be reconciled with him. So how can this be accomplished in a way to where God doesn't just overlook sin? He can't do that. He's holy. But at the same time, to where we don't face the punishment of sin. It's the gospel. Jesus pays for our sin in our place. And so God is found to be righteous because the sin is paid for, but he is also loving because we get salvation. The last little bit there Paul adds in is from Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, and it says that the righteous shall live by faith. And Paul is putting that in there to say that righteousness has always come by faith. If you look at God's interaction with Abraham in Genesis, in chapter 15, it says that Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. Habakkuk says that the righteous shall live by faith. Righteousness or salvation has always been by faith. It has never been by works. So Paul is quoting the Old Testament, communicate to the Jewish Christians in the Church of Rome that salvation is by faith alone. So Paul continues, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them. For God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse." So in order to articulate the gospel, Paul starts with the bad news, which is that we have sin and we're guilty and we deserve punishment for that sin. So that's what he's going to do. He talks about the wrath of God being revealed. Now, he's addressing, remember, Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. Well, the Jews separated humanity into Jews and Gentiles. The Gentiles, they would divide people up in accordance with Jews, yes, but then you had cultured Gentiles and you had uncultured Gentiles. The cultured Gentiles were referred to as Greeks, and the uncultured ones were referred to as barbarians. In this section of verses 18 through 32, Paul is addressing barbarians, or the uncultured Gentiles. And really he's making the point that they are guilty. So he talks about the wrath of God. Now, wrath is God's anger against sin. God is very angry against sin because it destroys, it brings death, it brings separation from himself. It's really driven by love. If you have somebody you love or care for and somebody else hurts that person, you may be filled up with anger at the injustice and the pain that was caused to that person that you love. That is wrath. It isn't anger apart from righteousness. It is anger because of righteousness against sin that is so damaging towards those that you love. And that's God's wrath. So he has wrath against sin. So mankind once knew God, knew about God, but suppressed that truth, decided, you know what, I don't care about God, I want to live life my own way according to my own desires. And so they suppress the truth about God. And this is true today. Everybody believes in the back of their mind somewhere, they know that God exists, but they suppress that truth. That's what Paul is teaching here. And he says that which is known about God is evident within them. You know, everybody is made in God's image. And everybody has the conscience. And those things are constantly bearing witness or telling us that, you know what, there's a God that we are accountable to, and He has morality. He is righteous. He is the one that determines right from wrong. And we know that just from our own conscience. I mean, people that are lost in the jungles of the Amazon, they have a conscience. They have some sort of code of right and wrong. Somebody does something against somebody else, and that other person says, hey, that's wrong, you shouldn't do that. Why? Because they have a conscience. They're made in God's image. And so they know there's a God that created and that God is righteous. Paul also says here that nobody is without excuse, saying, I didn't know that God exists, I didn't know that He was righteous, because we can all see the existence of God through what He has made. Not only ourselves and the conscience that we have, but just creation. We can all look around and say, somebody must have made this. And so this information about God's existence, that He is powerful, and that He's the creator, and that He is righteous, that we can see just from our own conscience and sense of morality that we have, is enough to condemn us, really. So that we are without excuse. We can't say, oh, I didn't know God existed. We all have these things which testify continually. Here's what it says in Psalms. The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of His hands. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. Their line is gone out throughout all the earth, and their utterances to the end of the world. So his point is that through creation, through our conscience, we are all guilty before God for our wrong behavior, and we rightly deserve His wrath or His righteous anger against sin. Paul elaborates to say that for even though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. So once upon a time, humanity knew God. You think of Adam and Eve, and you think of their children, they knew about God, but they didn't glorify Him as God. Basically, they chose to follow their own desires, to live life with themselves as king, right? Themselves as the leaders of their lives, and just do what they wanted to do, and they suppressed the truth about God's existence. And then it was a downward spiral from there. Therefore, they didn't give thanks to God, and as a result of being separated from God, they no longer were able to think clearly or reasonably. Our thinking is affected by our sinful desires. Oftentimes when we're chasing after something wrong that we really want, something we think will make us happy, for example, we don't think right. We're willing to hurt other people in order to get that thing. That's crazy thinking, but we do it all the time. So our selfish desires affect our ability to think clearly. So their thinking actually became futile. So they actually exchanged worship for the one true God for worshiping created things. They would make statues and worship those statues and so on. Now, why would they do this? This seems really crazy. But if you think about it in this way, it makes sense. We all have within us deep desires. We desire to be happy. We desire to have significance, to know who we are, our identity, and why we're important. We desire meaning or purpose in life. And we all desire hope when things are hard. And so we look for these desires to be met in many different things. It could be in our job. It could be in a love relationship. It could be in acquiring stuff that we get this fulfillment. And so we chase after these things and do whatever we have to get these things, even if it means hurting other people or ending up looking foolish. But we try to get these things because we think that these things will fulfill us. It's the same way with worshiping any kind of created thing in the past. When people would worship an idol, a statue, well, they thought that that statue would benefit their life. It would give them a sense of identity, or it would give them a need that they had or something that they wanted. So it's just the same today. Whenever we go after idols, we always get hurt, we look ridiculous, it doesn't work, and our thinking is really pretty ridiculous. So when humanity did this, what was God's response? Here it is. Therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions, for their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. And in the same way also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman, and burned in their desire toward one another, men with men, committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. Okay, so there you have it. God's response was to give them over to their selfish, sinful desires and to their futile thinking. Now, this is a judicial giving over. It is God allowing them to make their choice. They said, "We don't want you, God," and God, with a broken heart, I believe, said, "I allow you that choice." God allows us to choose to accept Him, to follow Him, or to not. Now, that doesn't mean He doesn't do anything to reach out to us. And we'll find, as Paul articulates the gospel here, God does a ton to reach out to us to bring us back to Himself. But He doesn't force us. And so God gave them over as a consequence to their sinful thoughts, their sinful desires, and the consequences that follow. So He describes some of the sinful behaviors that humanity has engaged in. One is homosexuality. He refers to lesbianism and homosexuality in this passage, which is clearly sinful. It's clearly a deviance from God's design for sexuality. So we know this also from Leviticus, where God clearly articulates righteousness and laws that pertain to sexuality. He says, "You shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination. Also, you shall not have intercourse with any animal to be defiled with it, nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is a perversion. Do not defile yourselves by any of these things, for by all these the nations which I am casting out before you have become defiled. For the land has become defiled. Therefore I have brought its punishment upon it, so the land has spewed out its inhabitants. But as for you, you are to keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not do any of these abominations, neither the native nor the alien who sojourns with you." Then Paul goes on to list many other sins. And if you look through that list, it's interesting because he doesn't exalt some sins over other sins, saying that some are worse. I mean, he mentions malice, which is terrible, but then he also mentions gossip right within that same list. So all of these sins bring about the judgment of God, the wrath of God, and he says at the end of the chapter that not only those that do these things, but those that approve of those that do these things deserve the penalty of death. Death simply means separation from God. Which, you think about it, if God is holy and righteous and good, and He is love, and we say, we don't want you, we want to do what we want to do, then we have that choice to reject Him, and we reject all that He is, and we go and we do what we want. That is death. It's separation. We are separating ourselves from God by our own choice. In the end, everybody gets what they want. If you want God, God will give you Himself completely. His holiness, His love, His perfection. If you don't want God, it will break His heart, but He will allow you that decision. But then you don't get anything that God is. You don't get all the good and all the love and all the purity and the justice or any of that. And you get just separation from Him with a whole bunch of people who have decided that they don't want Him either. That's the choice that God gives us. So let's get to the main idea. Remember, Paul is articulating the gospel, and the good news of salvation starts with the bad news, that all of humanity has, although they knew God, and although they have the witness of creation and the conscience and They're made in the image of God. There's no excuse of why they should say that God doesn't exist. They chose to reject God, were not thankful, and then went on this downward spiral of worshiping created things and all kinds of immoral behavior, incurring on themselves the wrath of God and the judgment of death or separation from God. I know it's not good news. It's bad news, but we're going to get to the good news, and you appreciate the good news after understanding the bad news. But that's the main point of this section of Romans chapter 1. Let's talk about application. Here's a question for you. What has God saved you from? Look at that list of sins. As I look at it, I see many things there that I'm guilty of. And I say, God, thank you so much for saving me from gossip. Thank you for saving me from being a hater of you in the past. Thank you for saving me from malice and many other things. So what has God saved you from?